It was Thursday afternoon, and the city moved as always. Hurried people, blaring horns, giant screen ads that no one really looked at. David, like every day, waited at the red light in front of the Insurgentes crossing. He was 39 years old, his mind stuck in an endless autopilot, until he saw her. A woman in a red coat crossed in front of him. She walked quickly, head bowed against the drizzle, but not enough to hide her face. The impact was instant. David felt as if someone had ripped the air from his lungs. The world went silent. It was Lucia, the same Lucia who, according to everyone, had died in 1997, when they were both just teenagers locked away in the Santa Lucía boarding school. He didn't react. The light changed, cars began honking, people pushed past him to move forward, but David stood still. He blinked, looked again. She was gone. She had disappeared into the crowd like a mirage. But he knew. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an illusion. It was her. That night, while trying to calm his mind, the memories came. Not clearly, but in scattered flashes. The concrete courtyard, the common room with small windows, Lucia's face, her eyes closed, a white sheet, a long hallway smelling of disinfectant. And then, the scream. A scream heard once, and then it was as if it had never existed. Santa Lucia was more than a boarding school. It was a cage disguised as an academic institution, located on the outskirts of Querétaro, surrounded by trees, with tall walls and guards on every corner. The children didn't enter there by choice, nor even by merit. They got in through connections, through money, through behavioral problems. David had arrived in 1996 after his parents' divorce. They told him it would be temporary, that it would help him, that it would heal him. The first days were silent, too silent. No TV, no phones, no visits. Everything was routine, control, discipline. At 6 a.m., wake-up bell. At 6:30, line-up. At 7, Daskauer, breakfast. And so on, hour after hour. Everything was timed. The walls were covered in phrases like, "Order brings freedom," "Thinking is remembering," "You are not your memories." Phrases you didn't understand, until they started making sense without you realizing it. Lucia arrived a few months later. She was 13, a year older than David. She was brilliant, quick-witted, and above all, she didn't obey. She questioned everything. She mocked the teachers, laughed when no one else did, and refused to attend the evaluations that took place on Monday and Thursday nights. They called them cognitive reinforcements. At 11 p.m., one by one, the students were called to the office of the psychologist, Mrs. Morera. They came out hours later, pale, tired, different. Lucia said something was happening in there. She said they had injected her with something, that they wanted to wipe their minds. Nobody believed her, or didn't want to believe her. Until one night, she didn't come back. It was May 97. There were screams, then hurried footsteps, then a dense silence. The next day, her bed was perfectly made, as if she had never existed. The principal gathered everyone. He said Lucia had suffered a collapse and died during the night. An unforeseeable clinical case, he said. A great loss for us all. But no one saw ambulances. No one saw her body. No one was allowed to ask questions. The days went on. Classes went on. The boarding school closed its doors a year later, without explanation. David never spoke of Lucia again. He moved to another city, finished his studies, became a functional person, though he always felt like he had left something behind, until he saw her cross the street, and everything came back. For days he tried to convince himself he was mistaken, but deep down he knew he wasn't. And one night he searched through his old trunk. Among papers and notebooks, he found a blue notebook with the Santa Lucia logo. On the last page, a note written in handwriting that wasn't his. If you see her again, don't follow her. They will make you forget again. M. Again? Then he understood. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Maybe they had already done it to him before. Maybe he had already forgotten things he didn't even know had ever existed. Maybe there were more children, more names, more stories. He decided to post a message on an old alumni forum. He used his real name. Does anyone remember Lucia? Has anyone ever wondered what really happened that night? 2 days later, he found a manila envelope in his apartment mailbox. No sender. Inside, a single photograph. Lucia, in her school uniform, standing in front of the boarding school's dining hall. In the background, blurred, a male figure in a white coat. And on the back, a handwritten phrase, "She wasn't the only one." Did this story catch you? Then subscribe and leave your like right now. It helps us keep revealing what others prefer to hide. David couldn't stop looking at the photo. It had been on his dining table for hours, next to a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The image of Lucia in 1997 was as sharp as the memory of her laugh, a laugh that time and silence had almost erased. But the figure in the background unsettled him even more. A tall man in a white coat, out of focus. He didn't look like a teacher. David didn't recognize him. He wasn't part of his memories. Or was he? That night, David didn't sleep. He began searching for names, lists of students, former teachers, newspaper articles. The little he found was incomplete or had been archived, deleted, forgotten. It was as if Santa Lucia had been erased from the map on purpose. Even so, he found an old forum with posts from former students, most dated between 2007 and 2015. Many messages were trivial, memories of the dining hall, complaints about discipline, the occasional anecdote, but one user caught his attention. JT27. That user spoke about memory gaps, events that didn't add up, and a locked door at the end of the north wing. David wrote to him. He didn't expect an answer, but the next day he received a message with an address in Puebla and a note, "Come alone, don't delay." On Saturday afternoon, David took a bus. The address led him to a modest cafe on an unpaved street. There, a man in his 40s with sunken eyes and trembling hands was waiting. He introduced himself as Julian Torres. He had been a student at Santa Lucía 2 years before David. The first thing he said was, "You've started remembering too, haven't you?" David nodded. Julian opened a small metal box he carried. Inside were personal items, a boarding school ID tag with his number, a braided lock of hair, a newspaper clipping. David read the headline, "2 minors die at boarding school. Authorities rule out negligence." "2?" David asked. "Lucia and Mateo," Julian replied. "But no one ever mentions Mateo. He was 10. They said he'd been transferred, but I saw him. They took him to the basement. He never came back." David didn't remember Mateo. Not even the name rang a bell. "That's the worst part," Julian said, his voice breaking. "They made us forget. They reprogrammed us. As if they had never existed. As if we were replaceable pieces." He explained that he had managed to salvage documents thanks to a former staff member, a therapist who, before committing suicide in 2001, left behind a folder with names, dates, and clinical evaluations. Julian pulled out several laminated sheets. On one of them was David's name. "Here, D27. That was you." David read aloud. "Patient shows high resistance to the implant. Unpredictable dissociative episodes. Partial reset with reconstructed identity module recommended." The blood in his veins turned cold. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he knew it wasn't just simple therapy. Julian explained that the boarding school had been part of an experimental project between a Mexican government agency and a European pharmaceutical company. The goal was to develop a technology for intensive mental rehabilitation for minors with traumatic histories or maladaptive behavior. But the methods were invasive, dangerous, illegal. They used strobe lights, guided suggestion, dissociative drugs. They recorded our sessions. They manipulated us like we were lab rats. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He didn't want to believe it, but part of him knew it was true. Too many things didn't fit in his memories. Gaps, holes, people he didn't remember meeting, emotions he couldn't trace the origin of. He decided to find someone else. He contacted another former student, Rodrigo Menchaca. They had been roommates, though David barely remembered his face. Rodrigo agreed to meet. They met in a quiet park in Mexico City. Rodrigo arrived looking nervous, with deep circles under his eyes. "I saw Lucia too," he said immediately. 3 months ago, she came to me, said they were still watching us, that it wasn't safe to talk through messages. David showed him the photo he had received. Rodrigo stared at it for a long moment, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. It had the same handwriting as the note in David's notebook. "Don't go back there. They're still inside." That phrase kept repeating, like a desperate warning, as if whoever wrote it knew time was running out. 4 days later, Rodrigo was found dead in his apartment. Official cause: overdose. But according to his family, he didn't use anything, and the door had been locked from the inside. David felt the past start to tangle with his present. Too many coincidences, too many deaths, and no clear answers. That's when he remembered a journalist, Clara Fuentes. She had written an article in 1998 titled "The Silence of Santa Lucía," but it was censored and she was fired. He looked her up. She was alive, retired, caring for her sick mother in Guadalajara. At first she didn't want to talk, but when David said "Lucia," she froze, stared at him. And after a long silence she said, "Come with me. There's something I need to show you." They went down to her basement. Clara switched on an old lamp and pulled out a dusty box. Inside, folders, tapes, clippings, and photos. Everything she had managed to save before being fired. "I never knew what to do with this," she admitted. "No one wanted to publish it. No one wanted to listen to me. I was afraid too." David opened a folder marked with the date the boarding school closed. Inside was a photograph from the Querétaro Forensic Institute. 2 small bodies on metal gurneys. But they weren't Lucia or Mateo. Then, "Where are they?" he asked in a hushed voice. Clara lowered her gaze. "That's what I've been trying to find out for 26 years. For weeks David lived in a trance. He slept little, spoke even less, and everything he did revolved around a single goal: finding the truth." The box Clara had shown him contained names, dates, clinical reports, but also documents in German, government seals, and codes he didn't understand. He asked a friend who worked as a legal translator for help. What they discovered chilled him to the bone. One of the documents described a neurobehavioral stimulation protocol funded by a pharmaceutical company based in Frankfurt. It detailed early intervention in infants with dissociative tendencies for testing purposes under the code name Project Lucia. The document didn't directly mention Santa Lucía, but the dates, code names, and ages of the subjects matched. It was more than a coincidence. Among the papers were also follow-up reports on certain students after their release from the boarding school. They were called reintegrated subjects. One of them bore David's name, D27. The report described his later life, his studies, jobs, relationships, every detail. As if someone had been watching him for years. David felt nauseous. If it was all true, then his entire life had been monitored and maybe interfered with. Which of his decisions were truly his, which had been planted? How many of his memories were real? And how many implants? He contacted Clara again, asking for full access to her archive. She hesitated, but finally handed him a sealed folder. "No one else has seen this. I received it in 2005 by mail, no sender. It contains the files I never managed to verify, but I think you can." Inside was a small black notebook, initials in gold. MLR. David didn't recognize them until he opened the first page. Mateo Luis Rivera, personal record, Santa Lucía, 1996-1997. It was Mateo's diary, written in a child's handwriting, but surprisingly lucid. There were pages describing the white light days, the memory games, and the nights when they called him to the office. The most chilling was the last entry. "Today they told me Lucia isn't coming back. They say she went with her mom, but I saw her sleeping with wires on her head. She wasn't moving. I'm scared too. I don't want them to make me forget. But if it happens, I hope someone reads this someday. Please, remember us." David closed the notebook, hands trembling. It was no longer a suspicion. It was testimony, a trace, a buried truth screaming from the past. He knew he couldn't just keep the documents. He had to act. He would scan everything, send copies to journalists, human rights defenders, independent media. If what he had came to light, it could force the authorities to investigate. Maybe even find those responsible who were still alive. But that night, someone knocked at his door. David wasn't expecting anyone. He looked through the peephole. It was her. Lucia. Not as he remembered her, but still unmistakable. Thinner, eyes more sunken, hair darker. She wore the same red coat he had seen her in weeks earlier. He opened the door without a word. She looked straight at him, without emotion, only exhaustion, as if she had been walking for years to get there. "I needed you to see me, so you'd know it's real," she said as she stepped inside. They sat down. David didn't ask anything. He waited, and Lucia began to speak. She told him she had escaped during one of the sessions, that she had faked a fainting spell and taken advantage of a power outage, that a gardener had helped her get out, that she had changed her name, her city, her life, but she had never been able to shake the feeling that someone was following her. She had never known peace. They had watched her, tried to find her, offered her money, then threatened her, until she decided to disappear completely. "But when I saw you on the street, I knew it was time, that I couldn't keep running." David asked about Matteo. Lucia lowered her gaze. Matteo was the first they tried to reset completely, but his mind couldn't handle it. He bled from the nose, seized, and they declared him transferred. And the others? Many didn't survive, others forgot, others accepted. David felt the world collapse around him. Everything he had believed about his childhood, everything he remembered, all a lie. Lucia handed him a flash drive. Inside, she said, were the original files from Project Lucia, videos, evaluations, confidential reports, and a list, all the names, including one David had never heard before, but which shook him when he read it. Isabel Herrera Ramos, 7 years old, sister of D27. David didn't have a sister, or did he? David held the flash drive as if it were a radioactive artifact. He knew that what it contained could be more powerful and more dangerous than anything he had discovered so far. With trembling hands, he plugged it into his computer. 3 folders appeared. One was titled Evaluations, another Protocols, and the last Subjects. He opened the last one. Inside were subfolders with codes, D01, D02, D03, all the way to D45. When he opened D27, his number, he found a PDF file titled Final Report, Patient D27. He opened it. There was his life, not his public biography, but the secret one. Admission date, August 12, 1996. Initial diagnosis, symptoms of anxiety and moderate aggression. Observations, absent mother, distant father, high dissociative potential. Then the horror began. Session 3, patient shows resistance to induced narrative. Session 5, elimination of recent episodic memory via repetition of light stimuli. Session 9, emotional blockage through suppression of maternal figure. And on the final page, result, subject stable with altered memory. Recommended reinsertion into urban environment without contact with related subjects. Evaluation every 24 months until the age of 25. Every word burned his eyes. They were telling him, in writing, that his life had been an experiment, that he had been isolated, manipulated, altered, that his story, his emotions, his identity had been edited like any other file. He searched for the folder of Isabel Herrera Ramos. He couldn't stop. Inside, there was only a single image, a girl of about 7 years old, dark hair, large eyes. At the bottom, subject not integrated, status missing. Lucia confirmed what he could not grasp. Isabel was his sister. They had been admitted together, but he was accepted into the program, and she was not. She had been sent somewhere else. Then the trail went cold, no more data, nothing but that photo, that gaze. David felt the ground crumble beneath him. He had lived his entire life without knowing he had a sister, without remembering her voice, her laughter, her existence. He had grown up with a constant sense of emptiness, and now he understood why. Lucia looked at him in silence. "That's why I came back," she said. "Because you were the only one who could understand it, because you lived it too, and because you also can decide what to do now." He didn't answer. He just looked at the screen, at the image of the girl, and then at the files, and he knew there was no turning back. 3 weeks passed. David handed the documents to Clara Fuentes, the journalist. He gave her full access. She put together an explosive report with names, dates, photos, and testimonies. She published it through an international network of independent media. The impact was immediate. International outlets began to pick it up. Governments demanded explanations. The pharmaceutical company denied any involvement. The Mexican government claimed the files were fabrications with no basis. But it was already too late. The truth was out. Several former students broke their silence. Some spoke publicly, others sent anonymous messages. All agreed on one thing. They had memories that didn't belong to them. Unexplainable gaps, recurring nightmares, shared symptoms. And all of them mentioned the same thing. A girl in a red coat. Lucia disappeared again. She left a note. "Don't look for me. Don't remember me. You've already done enough." David didn't know if he would ever see her again. One day, walking through the Alameda, a little girl approached him and handed him a letter. She didn't say a word. She just smiled. David opened it. It was a photo. Him as a boy, with a girl beside him. On the back, written by hand, "She's still waiting for you. But this time, remember her." David placed the letter in his wallet. He could no longer change the past, but he could make sure no one else forgot. If this story touched you, shook you, or made you question your own memory, subscribe to the channel and leave us a like. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching us from? We want to know. See you down there.